different prophecies every time. We're seeing him retelling the same prophecy again and again, interpreting the same prophecy again and again. Daniel is the one vision. There's only one vision in Daniel. Amen? There's only one vision in Daniel. The vision of the statue is the same vision as the vision of the beast, is the same vision of the vision of Daniel 8, is the same vision of Daniel 10 to 12. It's the same vision, remember? And remember that Daniel and apocalyptic prophecies, this principle works the same for Daniel and Revelation. Is we get a big picture, but what Daniel is doing is it's called repetition and expansion. We see the big picture and it's going in and giving us more detail on the same prophecy. More detail on the same prophecy. But what happens as we go through and look at the same vision and get more detail is every single time he's giving us more detail in Daniel on the same prophecy, on the same vision. It is giving us a different message each time in a sense. So if I was to summarize it this way, Daniel 2, we have the vision of all of the statue with all the different metals of the statue. And then remember, the very end of the prophecy ends with the rock cut with our hands coming and smashing the statue to pieces. Now, when Daniel received this vision, and remember, it wasn't actually Daniel who received the vision to begin with, it was Nebuchadnezzar. And who was the vision for? Primarily, it was for Nebuchadnezzar. But it was also for Daniel and his people as well. But the statue showed the flow of history in a big picture perspective. Not great detail, but showed the flow of history of all the world's empires that would influence God's people. It's not showing all the world empires. Doesn't tell us about China, doesn't tell us about Russia, doesn't tell us about Mongolia. It's about the empires that had influence over God's people. It shows us the flow of the world's empires, but it shows us that all this world's empires are temporary and only God's kingdom will be eternal. Okay? If we want to give it in a really broad perspective, Daniel 2 tells us the message that there are people that will be powerful here during Earth's history. There will be human kingdoms, but those human kingdoms will be temporary, only God's kingdom is eternal. That's the message. Then we see that there is Daniel 7, and the new information we have in Daniel 7 is that there's this little horn power that's introduced. This little horn power who will want to deceive and who will try to take God's place, but it will be unsuccessful. And ultimately, it gives us a picture of there being a judgment scene before the second coming. There's a judgment scene before the second coming. And so, again, there's this information that we get that ultimately focuses on this idea that there is going to be a judgment before the second coming. There's going to be a judgment before the coming of God's kingdom, which is an interesting perspective. Daniel 8 gives us this picture that this little horn power is going to want to attack God's sanctuary and attack God's people being able to fulfill God's law. Okay? This idea that this little horn power will attack God's sanctuary, okay, and will distract people from the key focus, which is the sanctuary in heaven, and will try to replicate that sanctuary here on earth. But that God will deal with that and will re-establish a focus on the sanctuary in heaven. Picture from Daniel 8. Daniel 9, we remember we were introduced. Daniel was interested and focused on the re-establishment of God's holy place, the temple. He wanted to see the temple re-established. And Daniel 9 tells us that ultimately the message that comes through Daniel 9 is that God is not going to establish his righteousness, re-establish his righteousness through an anointed place, but rather he's going to do it through an anointed person. And then we come to Daniel 10. Daniel 10 to 12 is the one section. We've got different chapters there, but it's the one vision, it's the one section. Last week we introduced Daniel 10 and showed how in Daniel 10 he gets this vision. Remember, he's coming to the end of his life and he's mourning. He's mourning because he knows he's coming to the end of his life. He thought that he would see the temple re-established. He's seeing the people go back, Ezra and the people go back to Israel, but it's not going well, and he knows that he's not going to see the temple re-established. That's the one thing he's been hoping for. And he's mourning, he's discouraged. But he gets a vision of Jesus. Remember, he has this vision of this man that looks like Jesus. And so even though Daniel wouldn't see the temple rebuilt, God gives him a vision of the real fulfillment. Remember, not an anointed place, but an anointed person. He sees the better fulfillment through vision. He doesn't see the fulfillment of the temple being restored, but he sees the one that's greater than the temple. And he's told that he's greatly loved by God. He's encouraged. Today we're going to look at Daniel 11 because Gabriel comes along and tells Daniel in Daniel 10 he's going to interpret the vision. What vision? What vision? There's no vision in Daniel 11. Okay, normally remember how does it happen in the other ones? In Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, what happens? There is a vision and then there's an explanation. Daniel 9 and Daniel 11, there's no vision, there's just an explanation. Okay? Daniel 2, 7, and 8, there's a vision and an explanation. Both Daniel 9 and 11, there's no vision, there's just an explanation. Making sense? So Daniel 9 and Daniel 11 are simply an explanation of the previous visions. They're an explanation of the previous visions. That's the first point we need to remember today as well. So what we are seeing in Daniel 11 is he has come to show him the vision. So Daniel 10, if you open to Daniel 10 and you have a look at what Gabriel, that doesn't tell us the name of the angel in actual fact, but the angel who has come to explain the vision to him in Daniel 10, notice the words that he uses. Okay? Notice the words he uses in telling you what he has come to explain to him. In verse 14, I have come, Daniel 10 verse 14, I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision pertains to the days yet future. Up to this point in Daniel 10, there's been no vision. You see, it's the same as Daniel 9. Gabriel comes and explains a vision, but there's no vision. He's explaining the previous vision. How do we know it's Daniel 8 that he's explaining? Because of a key term. And remember that the Bible uses hyperlinks. It uses similar terms to make us link back to a previous thing. What is the key term in this that tells us it's that Daniel 8 vision is explaining? Notice what he says, what will happen to your people in the latter days or last days. That term is used in the Daniel 8 vision. That term is not used in the other visions. It is used specifically in the Daniel 8 vision, latter days. This vision pertains to the time of the end. So if you look back in Daniel 8 and verse 17, he says, Son of man, understanding the vision, that the vision pertains to the time of the end, or the latter days. And verse 26, the vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told us true, keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. You see, it's similar language being used here in Daniel chapter 10. What does he say he's come to explain? I have come to give you understanding, Daniel 10:14, come to give you understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the future. Two key terms used in Daniel 8 are used here in Daniel 10. So he is explaining the Daniel 8 vision. Okay, so that's number one, Daniel. And let me say this. Daniel chapter 11 is one of the most confusing passages in the Bible. If you ever come across someone who says to you, I will explain to you every single bit of Daniel 11 and how it's fulfilled, let me just say, put a big warning later on what I've got to say. Put a big warning label on what people have to say. They say that they can explain to you every line of Daniel 11. Why? Because there are some parts of Daniel 11 that just aren't clear. They could apply to many things. What we want to look at today is only give you a tool of how you can look at Daniel 11 and get the key points out that are coming across. Okay? There's a few things we need to remember when we're looking at Daniel 11. Firstly, we need to remember it's an explanation of Daniel 8. Vision of Daniel 8. It's a further explanation of the vision of Daniel 8. The second thing is that unlike the previous explanations, in the previous visions that Daniel gets, there's always a symbol used, isn't there? There's always symbolic language. Daniel 2, what's the symbol? What's the symbolic language used in Daniel 2? A statue, isn't it? Okay, a statue with metals. That's a symbolism. What's the symbolism used in Daniel 7? Daniel 7, what's the symbolism used? Daniel 7, the symbolism used is beasts, isn't it? Different animals is the symbolism in Daniel 7. Daniel 8, the symbolism used is, again, animals, isn't it? You've got the ram and you've got the goat. Daniel 8. Daniel 11 doesn't have symbolism. It has descriptions. So Daniel 11 is different to some of the others because in explaining the vision of Daniel 8, he's using descriptions, descriptive language about stuff that's going on, okay, rather than symbolism. So that's one point that's a bit different. One point that's a bit different. So ultimately, what are we going to be looking at here? Looked at Daniel 10, the introduction. Gary was giving a summary of the same vision of Daniel 8. This time he doesn't use symbols, but rather he uses descriptions of people, powers, and events. And people have come tripped up trying to explain and give interpretations of these descriptions. But how can we read Daniel 11 and understand what it's saying without making the mistake that so many people have made? Too many people have been tried to be too deterministic in interpreting Daniel 11. They've tried to link a historical event to every description. Okay, people have tried to link a historical event to every description. I'm not going to aim to do that today. What are some of the principles we can use in looking at Daniel 11 and not Daniel 11 and 12 and not get tripped up? Here are 4 principles we can use when looking at Daniel 11. Firstly, we need to cross-check what we're looking at in Daniel 11 with Daniel 7 and 8, because it's the same vision that's being explained, okay, with different detail. So if it doesn't link back into Daniel 8, you've got to find where are the parts of Daniel 8 that link in with what's happening in Daniel 11. Okay, if you're not linking the two together, you're already on the wrong track. You have to link the two together. Secondly, don't use history to interpret the prophecy. Don't use history to interpret prophecy, use the Bible. It is a mistake when people try to look at historical things, and there are sometimes where historical things match up with things in the Bible. But let the Bible interpret itself. Let the Bible interpret its own symbolism. Okay, let the Bible interpret its own symbolism. Don't use history to interpret the Bible, use the Bible. Third, and this is the most important thing in Daniel 11. There are a lot of details in Daniel 11 I don't believe we fully understand. Okay? You can guess, you could probably think, oh, this means this, but there's some details of Daniel 11 you just never going to fully get. But there are some parts of Daniel 11 that are clear. Okay? So differentiate the stuff that is clear in Daniel 11 from the stuff that is not so. And what we call these clear points are signposts. There are points through Daniel 11 that clearly connect back to Daniel 8. There are certain spots in Daniel 11 that clearly connect back to Daniel 8, and you can use as markers to know where you're at. Does that kind of make sense? There's signposts, what we call signposts in Daniel 11. Things that clearly connect back to the previous vision, so we can go approximately where we're at. So, descriptions which you can clearly attach to events, and let sections which are unclear remain unclear. Fourthly, keep in mind the purpose of this section is focused on what will happen to God's people in the latter days. The whole focus of this vision is not to determine the details of history. What does he say? He says, I will describe to you what will happen to your people in the latter days, the end of time. So really the focus of telling Daniel this detail is not for him to be able to know every event that's happening and what's happening at one point in time, but what is going to be the outcome for God's people in the latter days, the end of time. Okay. So we're going to keep those four things in mind through Daniel. We're not looking at every single point, but we're wanting to, what we're going to go through and look for are what are those clear signposts? What are those clear signposts in Daniel 11 that we can then understand? So let's start in Daniel 11 verses 1 to 4. Daniel 11 verses 1 to 4, there's not really any mystery. Okay, it's pretty clear. Remember, let things that are clear be clear, things that are unclear remain unclear. Verses 1 to 4. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection to him. This is the angel speaking. This is the angel speaking. He's saying, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and protection to him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, three more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than any of them. And as soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Now, is there any mystery about what this is? He's saying what? There's going to be four more kingdoms in the kingdom of Persia. The last king of Persia will become exceedingly rich. We will do what? Attack Greece. Do you know who that was in history? That was King Xerxes. King Xerxes became very rich. What did he do? He attacked Greece. He wanted to conquer Greece. He tells us how this will end. And a mighty king will arise from where? From Greece. And he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. How do we know this? Because remember, this is an explanation of which vision? It's an explanation of Daniel 8. So, that's it. We're looking for our signposts. You want to know our signposts. So here is the links between Daniel 11 and 8. In Daniel 8, we have the ram and its name. It's named as Persia, representing the king of Persia. In Daniel 11, there's no symbols, but we're told that Persia will have four more kings and then attack Greece. In Daniel 8, we have a goat with a large horn, which Daniel 8 tells us that large horn is its first king. Okay, and it's named as Greece. And Daniel 11 tells us a great king will arise. From where? From Greece. Okay, so we can see that the beginning of Daniel 11 is the beginning of Daniel 8. And notice that here, a notable horn named as the leading king of Greece, which was Alexander the Great. And in Daniel 11, there is a mighty king. Clear so far? We've got a signpost because it's clear. We have a signpost because it's clear. It gives us a starting point as being during the time of the Medo-Persians. Clearly tells us that the king of the Greeks will defeat them, but ultimately it tells us in verse 4, but as soon as he is risen, the king of Greece, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside him. What happened to Alexander the Great? Before he had any children, he died. And what happened to the Greek kingdom? It was split in four. It was split in four and did into his 4 journeys. So, this is exactly Daniel 8, and we've got this clarity of where this starts, where we're starting. It's the same as the vision of the ram and the goat in Daniel 8. After this, the next verse, in verse 5, we're introduced to a theme that runs throughout the book of Daniel. And this is where things get confusing. We were introduced to a theme of the king of the north and the king of the south. And so many people have gone into so much detail, detailing who the king of the north and the king of the south is. This first section, from verse 5 down to around verse 14 or so, people can kind of get a bit of a picture of how the Greek kingdom, what happened within the Greek kingdom and how people fought against each other. People get ideas about maybe Cleopatra being in there as well, all different sorts of ideas. But my point to you is, it doesn't matter too much, knowing the exact details of the king of the north versus the king of the south. You can get a bit of an idea of how history is happening, but there's a lot of description in there that could be many different things. But ultimately, you go from verses 5 down to verses 5 down to verses 13, and there's this king of the north and the king of the south. There's this intrigue, and it's describing events that are happening during the Greek kingdom. Okay, that's all I'm going to go into on that. And you can find detail for yourself that might give further explanation of that. But my point is, it's not a signpost. What we want to look at is what these clear signposts are. Does that make sense? Clear signposts are things that match up with Daniel 8. Okay? Only when you get those things that match up with Daniel 8 will you then go back, be able to go back and see that this fits between here and here. Make sense? Okay? So the first signpost is Daniel verses 1 to 4. It's the same as the goat, the ram and the goat in Daniel 8. When we get down to verse 14, we come to our next signpost. Verse 14 of Daniel, we come to our next signpost. Notice what verse 14 says. Now, in those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision that they will fulfill now. Now, the interesting thing here is different versions of the Bible interpret this slightly differently. But when you go back to the original language, it becomes quite clear. Remember, we're looking at the language that is used in Daniel 11 that matches up with the language that's used in the previous visions, especially Daniel 8. So this is what I'll show you. Okay, this is when we're starting to have a look. Okay, we're going on from where we were. We have a horn that was broken. Okay, in Daniel 8, we've got the kingdom being broken in Daniel 11. We have the 4 horns going up towards the wings, named as 4 kingdoms. We have kingdoms divided towards the 4 wings in Daniel 11. See the clarity? And then in Daniel 8, the next thing we had in Daniel 8 was a little horn. Okay, the next thing in Daniel 8 was the little horn, which represented Rome, the Roman Empire. This little horn represented Rome. And in Daniel 11, we have a small people becoming strong. In Daniel 11, we have described a small people becoming strong because of the little horn that became great. So this is a clue that's telling us that this particular section is linking us to Rome. Linking us to Rome. And specifically in verse 14, have a notice here. If we have a look at this, the literal meaning of verse 14, where it says in my Bible, it says the violent ones. It describes the violent ones. Literally, if you look at the original language, the violent men of your people is sons of the breakers of your people. In the Hebrew, it's using the term breakers of your people. Now remember, we want to look at the language and marry it back up to the previous visions. So where else have we heard this term, breakers of your people? Okay? Have a look in here. It says they would come in fulfillment of the vision. Okay? They would exalt themselves. They would be breakers of your people. And we see already from other passages in Daniel that breaking is a key characteristic of growth. Because Daniel 2 verse 40, how is that fourth kingdom, the kingdom of iron, described? Well, how is it described? It breaks in pieces. It breaks in pieces those who are before it. That's a description of growth. Daniel 7, verses 7 and 23, what did this kingdom, this fourth great terrible beast kingdom do? It broke things in pieces. Okay, broke things in pieces. And Daniel 8, verses 10, 13, and 24 describes this little horn kingdom as trampling upon them, destroying the mighty, and also the holy people. This is what it describes it as doing. So, what is this new one? In verse 14, these violent ones who will break your people, it's using that same language as the Roman Empire. So this gives us another clue, another signpost. So Daniel verses 1 to 4 is the description of both Medo-Persia and Greece. Daniel 14 is Rome. Okay, so if you want to understand what's being described in between, it's describing what's happening in between the rise of Greece and the rise of Rome. Okay, that's all that Daniel 5 to 13 is describing. The events that are happening between the rise of Greece and the rise of Rome. There are signposts, make sense? And so it doesn't matter too much whether you understand all those little details. It's just giving us filler, context and filler. But if we want to understand these signposts, this is where we need to go. So in these passages, it always refers to what Rome would do to the people of God, and that they would break apart. The other thing that we see as well, is in verse 16. It says, "But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand." This is describing, again, the kingdom of Rome, and it describes the beautiful land. Where is the beautiful land used previously? The beautiful land is used in Daniel 8, verse 9. "Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land." You see here the hyperlinks, the same language being used. So this is describing the kingdom of Rome. It's using the same language. Okay? It's using the same language here in verse 16 as well. So what's the next signpost that we have on? We've got Medo-Persia and Greece, we've got the rise of Rome, verse 14. What's the next signpost that we'll be looking at? What's the next signpost that we have described in the prophecies of Daniel 8, Daniel 8 and 9? Is what would this power do? What does this power do, Daniel 9, to the prince of the covenant? What does this power do to the prince of the covenant? Daniel 9. What does this power do to the prince of the covenant? The Messiah, the prince, what will happen to him? He will be, Daniel 9, and I'll read Daniel 9, verse 25 and 26. "You are to know and discern from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to Messiah, the prince, who will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. He will be built again with plaza and way, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary." So it's describing that the people of the prince who is to come, which is the little horn power, would describe which is destroy the sanctuary and the city, but what also would happen to the Messiah, the prince? He would be cut off, the anointed one, the anointed prince, the prince of his people. So if you have a look at Daniel 11 and verse 22, notice there's a description here. Now you've got to remember, we'll look at key terms. When you're reading through it, it can be confusing, but there's key terms. Verse 22, he gave me instruction and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I have now come forth." 11 verse 22. 11 verse 22. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered. And also the prince of the covenant. What's going to happen to the prince of the covenant? He will be shattered. He will be broken. Remember what happens to the prince of the covenant? He will be cut off. Okay, the prince of the covenant, the prince of your people will be cut off. The prince of your people will be cut off in Daniel 9, Daniel 11, verse 22. This power will shatter the prince of the covenant. And he will shatter his people. So what does Rome do? Rome in 9 cuts off the Messiah and shatters the people, shatters the temple and the sanctuary. Here, what does he do? He shatters the people and he shatters the prince of the covenant, cuts him off. These are little allusions, but they're powerful, important terms. So in verse 22, what are we seeing described in verse 22? The breaking of the prince of the covenant is a great landmark prediction of Daniel 11. It's a great landmark prediction of Daniel 11. History's major reference point from which we check our bearings in the rest of the chapter. This is a crucial event in world history on which the destiny of the human race depends. So it's describing the death of Jesus, the Messiah being cut off, prince of the covenant being shattered. This is the sign point of that anointed one who makes a covenant with many. Because how many know he's the prince of the covenant? What does he do during that week? He makes a covenant with many for that 1 week. The prince of the covenant will be shattered, cut off. And it's interesting because it says that it's describing this king. So there's two kings being described. Remember, verse 14 is the rise of the Roman Empire. Okay, rise of the Roman Empire. Verse 20 talks about a king, then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger or in battle. Many people describe that as being Caesar Augustus. And who was the emperor after Caesar Augustus? It was Tiberius. The next one, verse 21. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honour of kingship is not being conferred. But he will come at a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by a tree. A lot of people see that as a description of Tiberius. Tiberius was not a liked emperor at all. He was a violent. Then verse 22, we have the prince of the covenant. When did Jesus die? Jesus died during the reign of Tiberius. Died during the reign of Tiberius. So when we look at all of this, it seems to match up. And it's that clear signpost that verse 22 is Jesus' death on the cross. Verse 23 to 39 I've never heard a really good description of verse 23 to 29. The issue is not that you can't identify things. The issue is that there are so many things that can be referred to by some of the events. Verse 29, 22, 23 to 39. But let's pick up on a few verses. Turn with me to verse 28 and verse 30. Let's see if we can pick up some familiar language. Some familiar language in 28 and verse 30. Verse 28 is describing a particular power. Okay, we'll go to verse 27. As for both things, their hearts will be intent on evil, they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end will still come to the appointed time. Then he will return to land, his land, much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. What do we call the Holy Covenant? The Holy Covenant is God's laws, isn't it? So here's going to be a power whose heart is set against God's laws. A power whose heart is set against God's laws, against the Holy Covenant. Okay? And he will take action and return to his own land. Verse 30. It says, for ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened, return, become enraged to the holy covenant, and take action. So he will come back and show you regard to those who forsake the holy covenant. So we have a power here whose heart is against God's laws. Verse 31 describes this. Forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortresses, do away with the regular sacrifice. Now this should remind us of a few things from Daniel 8. Remember this little horn power. Listen to how it describes what this little horn power will do in Daniel 8. Daniel 8 and verse 10, going onwards, talking about the little horn power. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts of the stars to fall down and be trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal to the commander of the host that removed the regular sacrifice from him, and his place of sanctuary was thrown down. On account of the transgression of the host, be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, it will fling truth to the ground and form through across them. Isn't this similar to some of the language that's being used in this section of Daniel 11? So it seems that these descriptions that are happening around verses 28, 30, 31, verse 33, what does this power do to God's people? Verse 33, those who have insight amongst the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword and by the flame, by captivity and plunder for many days. What will this power do to God's people? Those who respect God, it will kill them. It will persecute them. The same happens with this power in Daniel 8. It will just persecute God's people. Verse 36 and verse 37, this is what it describes. Then the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. He will prosper in the indignation until the indignation is finished. That which is decreed is done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, magnify himself above all. Again, this is the same description as the little horn. You can see some of these key pictures, right? So when you want to think about what these key signposts are, we've got Medo, Persia, and Greece, verse 1. Verse 14, we have the rise of the Roman Empire. Verse 22, we have the death of Jesus on the cross. Here, from verse 28 down to 39, we have descriptions that fit the papacy. You know, the little horn power, when it would persecute God's people, when it would magnify himself above the throne of God, when he would try to change God's times and laws, okay? You'd be against the Holy Covenant, against God's laws, okay? These are the same descriptions we have of the little horn power. So again, big picture, what are we seeing? And this all points to us as being the same as that power in Daniel 8, which would end the regular sacrifice. In the regular sacrifice. Our next signpost comes from verse 40. Have a look at verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, horsemen, and many ships, and he will enter countries and overpower them and pass through. Notice what it says at the very beginning. At the time of the end, or the end time. It describes how this power will develop conflict. It describes conflict and how this power, and in verse 44, that he will come to an end. He will come to an end and no one will help him. So this power, these powers that work against God's law, against God's people, what's going to happen? They will come to an end. And here we come to the greatest part of the law. This vision wraps up at the beginning of Daniel chapter 12. This vision wraps up at the beginning of Daniel chapter 12. Verses 1 in Daniel chapter 12 tells us this. Like while this power is conflict at the end of time with God's people, it says, now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as never occurred, as there was never a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So notice here that there's a few things that are happening. Michael, the prince, and who else has been described as the prince of your people? Previously, the Messiah, hasn't he? The Messiah was described as the prince of your people, and Michael was described as the prince of your people. Michael stands up, and what happens? Stands up. This is the same description we get in Revelation of when Jesus comes to earth again. He will stand up. So who do we think Michael is? Michael must be Jesus. Another name for Jesus. In fact, the name Michael in Hebrew translates who is like God. It's a question. Who is like God? Michael is Jesus. Same one. Prince of your covenant, the prince of your people. Okay. The one who stands up at the end and who's coming brings about resurrection. Okay. Notice that. So Michael, the prince of God's people, standing up, and this draws imagery from a king taking power. So what does all of these descriptions talk about? Every single one of them is that what will happen is that there will be all these kingdoms of the earth, all this intrigue, all this persecution of God's people. And what will end up happening is that how will it all end? It will all end when who? Jesus comes again. It will all end when Jesus comes again. Rock cut without hands in Daniel 2. Okay? Rock cut without hands in Daniel 2. The sanctuary will be restored back to its proper place. But we're talking about the heavenly sanctuary, not the earthly sanctuary. So when we see this all being fulfilled in Jesus. And at this time there is a resurrection. But notice here in Daniel 12, who's being resurrected in Daniel 12, verse 2? It describes that there's two groups of people being resurrected in Daniel 12, verse 2. Who are the two groups being resurrected? Notice what it says. I'll read it for you. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Who's being resurrected? Who's being resurrected? Everyone, both the, what are the two groups we normally describe them as? Both the wicked and righteous. So Daniel 12 verse 2 describes both of them being resurrected. Are they resurrected at the same time? Are the wicked and the righteous resurrected at the same time? Not. Daniel 12, Revelation tells us what?
The righteous will rise.
The righteous will rise first, and then when the wicked will be resurrected.
Yes.
It actually tells us in Daniel 20, Revelation 20. I'll read it for you so that you're not just thinking I'm making it up. Revelation 20 tells us when the wicked are resurrected. Revelation 20, verse 5. The rest of the dead will not come to life until the 1,000 years will be completed.
Yep.
When are the righteous resurrected? At the beginning of the 1,000 years. When are the wicked resurrected? At the end of the 1,000 years. There's no doubt about it. It's so clear. Daniel 12, verse 2 says that they're both resurrected.
Yeah, but it doesn't say time.
It doesn't say the time, but here's another thing we need to understand when we're looking at prophecy in the Bible. Prophecy in the Bible and apocalyptic prophecy is not concerned with the timing of events. It's not concerned with the timing of the events unless it gives a really clear, detailed description of the timing of those events. Where it gives a detailed description of the timing of events, then it is concerned with it. But it's more concerned with what is the outcome of the events. Make sense?
Yeah.
And what the outcome that he's telling us here is that some will be resurrected to eternal life and some will be resurrected to what? Destruction. Contempt. Some to eternal life, some to contempt. Who are those that are resurrected to eternal life? It tells us in verse 1. It tells us in verse 1. Everyone whose name is written in the book of life. Those who have accepted Jesus. Those who have kept the commandments and their faith in Jesus. And remember, what is the whole point of Daniel 11 and 12? What is the whole point of Daniel 11 and 12? The angel tells us in Daniel 10 verse 14, I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people at the end. People pore over Daniel 11 and they focus on all these little details and that they're missing the point. Because what's the point? What will happen to God's people when? At the end. In other words, he's saying all this stuff is going to happen. There's going to be kingdoms fighting against each other. And what's going to happen to God's people while that's happening? How does it describe what happens to God's people during the fighting of all the different kingdoms of this earth? It says that what will happen to us is we will be persecuted. We will be put to death. But what happens at the very end? Those who are faithful are resurrected to what? Eternal life. That's the point that he's making. That's the point of Daniel chapter 11 and 12. It's a linking back to that previous prophecy. Now, why is he telling Daniel this? You know why he's telling Daniel this? Guess how old Daniel is? It's about in his late 80s. Daniel is coming to the end of his life without seeing the fulfillment of God's promises. Daniel's coming to the end of his life without seeing the fulfillment of God's promises. And what is God saying to Daniel? When God's promise is going to be fulfilled for all of God's faithful people? It's not here and not there. But when? At the end. When the resurrection happens. Here's another point I want to point out. He says here, there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, when Michael stands up. Is this describing that there's going to be some great tribulation just before the second coming? Remember? Michael will stand up and there'll be a time of distress. Is that describing some great time of trouble before the second coming? There's already been trouble described before that. Let me make a point. It may not be describing time of trouble before the second coming. It does describe that there's persecution before that, okay? But is there a time of trouble after Jesus' second coming? Is there a time of trouble described in the Bible after the second coming? Is there a time of trouble described after the second coming? Yes, there is. Read with me in Revelation. We'll say this and then we get to our last point. Revelation verse 20, verse 7. Listen to me as I read this. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive who? The nations, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, gather them together for war. Who is he gathering together? The wicked who've been resurrected, correct? How many people is that going to be?
Multitude.
And what are they doing with one intent? Attacking who? God's people. Has there ever been trouble in the history of the earth as the trouble that's going to happen then? That's going to be far less than anything that's happened during Earth's history. But here's the point. What's the end of that? What does it say happens?
Burned.
They are judged
But still, you know.
and thrown into the lake of fire. And are not successful. But what's our reaction when we see the wicked destroyed? God will grab those wicked who attack God's people in the kingdom. He will throw them like a fire. What's our reaction when we see them destroyed? I'll tell you what our reaction is when we see them destroyed. 21 verse 4 tells me what our reaction is when we see them destroyed. 21 verse 4. This is describing what God will do to us after that happens. It says, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Describing what God will do for the righteous. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Who's crying? This, we've just seen the destruction of the wicked. What is everyone doing?
Witness. You can see.
Because God does what? Straight after that, He wipes away the tears from your eyes. What's everyone's reaction when they see the wicked destroyed? Even the wicked just came up and tried to kill us all. And when God destroys all the wicked, what do we do? Cry.
Yeah, because there are no ones there.
We're not cheering, yay, God. We see Satan destroyed in the lake of fire, and what do we do? If you can't be sad for the wicked, I wonder where you stand. There's no cheering. There's no celebrating. What does Ezekiel describe God's reaction to the death of the wicked? Does it say that God celebrates the death of the wicked? He says God does not rejoice at the death of the wicked. He is sad. When we see the wicked die because of their own choice to reject God, our reaction will be deep sadness. The people we love. Even Satan, our hearts will have pity for him because of how evil he became of his choices. Our reaction is sadness. Is there relief? Yeah, that's relief. Of course. Right. Not very sad. So, as I summarize Daniel, I want to come away with some key messages. We will be moving on to Revelation. As we look at Revelation, I'm not going to be just again going through interpretation of Revelation. What I want us to do is understand the book of Revelation, how it's structured, understand how we can read it properly, understand as we go through Revelation, understand some of the key principles of how it's written, and how do you interpret Revelation. So we're going to be looking at more than just that, and we're also going to be looking at some of the key themes of Revelation. Some of the key themes. You go to any Revelation seminar and get this verse means this. That's not what I want to use. What I'm doing is not disagreeing with those, okay? But it's giving you a deeper understanding and appreciation of what's really going on. So, what are the key points? Well, that's a good slide. Take a photo of it. These are some of the key landmarks. Like I was saying, those key landmarks in Daniel 11. How they relate, and they all relate back to Daniel 8. If anyone wants a copy of that, I can always send it. So what are the key points that we finish up? Okay. Firstly, what does Daniel tell us? Daniel tells us that we won't see a full resolution of the problem of this world here and now. We won't see a full resolution. Even though God is here and accomplishing his purposes, God's promises will not be fully realized until the coming of Jesus. Secondly, God's people don't need to get caught up in the controversies of this world. But what do we need to do? Just remain faithful to God. What did Daniel and his friends do during their lifetime? Did they get caught up in all the controversies of what was going on in Babylon? All the controversies of what was happening in Medo-Persia? Or did they just focus and remain faithful to God? They remain faithful to God through the conflict, even though it may not end well for us here and now. They weren't concerned with how does it end for me? But how can I be faithful to God? Just like Daniel and his friends lived during their times, this will be the lot of God's people all through time. It's the same for all of us. And then the last point is that no matter how things pan out for us here, Jesus will deliver his people and establish his kingdom here on earth. It's not about how your life goes here and now. God will establish his kingdom here on earth. He will establish his kingdom here on earth. Let's have our final key.
Tradition.